This is the Oil Revolution Objective 2 about John D. Rockefeller and how John D. Rockefeller dominates the post-Civil War oil industry. Now, a lot of people have mixed feelings about John D. Rockefeller in history. Some will call him one of the greatest businessmen that ever lived. Others would refer to him as a robber baron, somebody who absolutely destroyed the American dream for people around him. Too greedy, too rich, whatever the case may be. But no matter how you look at it, he's one of the most polarizing figures in the history of American business. But he came from some pretty rough beginnings of his own and built himself into a major businessman. When Rockefeller was growing up in Cleveland, Ohio, he grew up in poverty. His father was a con man that he absolutely despised. At one point, his father even told his son John, "Don't even trust me." His father would go around trying to sell phony lubricants and phony medicines and things like that, and was widely regarded as someone who would take a buck any way he could get it and then skip town. Well, John himself really didn't care for that lifestyle, didn't care for his father too much, and so he decided to go his own path. He was a successful businessman by the age of 19, and as he grew older, made it very clear that he was very pious in his personality. He didn't drink, he didn't smoke, and he didn't swear. He was very religious, and he felt that God had spared him to do great things. Most notably, when Rockefeller avoided being in a train wreck that was on its way to New York City, he felt that God had spared him to do great things for society, although in a very somewhat ruthless way. He used to be famous for saying, "The good Lord gave me my money," and he felt that it was his divine right and responsibility to get wealthy and to show everyone what wealth was and what a great businessman was. As a result, John D. Rockefeller believed in something called social Darwinism. Charles Darwin had offered up his theory of evolution, part of which said that the strong shall survive and the strong will eat the weak and kill the weak, or whatever the case may be. Well, Rockefeller believed in social Darwinism, and he said that in society it is still the survival of the fittest. Now, like I mentioned before, he's considered one of the most ruthless businessmen to ever live. He lived at a time when business was completely unregulated by the government. They never stepped in with rules or regulations or standards or anything like that. It was kind of like the Wild West of business. You just did whatever you wanted to do to try to get ahead, and Rockefeller took full advantage of that. Now, Rockefeller is most famous for forming Standard Oil Company in 1870, only 5 years after the Civil War, and he formed it in Cleveland, Ohio. The basic idea of Standard Oil, which would continue on for generations, was to refine oil into kerosene at extremely low prices. Now, as you know, from Objective 1, eventually the kerosene market would drop, so Standard Oil then became the leader in providing gasoline for the new automobiles. Standard Oil eventually turned into a monopoly. It was not uncommon to see Standard Oil gas stations on roadsides wherever you went, waiting for vehicles to get filled up with Standard Oil gasoline. Standard Oil is still a major contributor to the gasoline industry today. Now, nobody denies that John D. Rockefeller did a very good job as a businessman, generating buzz for his product, selling his product at low prices. But where people started to have a problem with Rockefeller was the way he built his oil monopoly. The simple fact of it is that Standard Oil became known as the Octopus. If you can see in various parts of this here, getting a hold of politicians and other oil workers, getting a hold of presidents and controlling them, getting a hold of the U.S. Capitol or the White House and controlling that, controlling offshore shipping, and of course controlling other oil wells. John D. Rockefeller, when he built his monopoly, was not the most popular man in America. People either admired him for how he built his business, or they completely hated him for what he was doing because it hurt small businesses around the country. Now the question is how? How did he get a hold of all of these small oil companies? How did he get a hold of all of these railroads and all these shipyards and all these banks? How did the Octopus, as it came to be known as, get a hold of all these things? Well, it would start with the oil market, and it was a pretty simple formula that he would use. The first thing, once he established himself and made some millions where he could afford to take the hit, is that he would flood the market with an oil surplus. Now, as you guys know from economics, if you have a surplus of anything, too much of anything, the price of it is going to go down. The value of it is going to go down. You simply have too much. In regular retail stores, when they have too much of a product, they have sales. They drop the price. Well, it's the same thing here. He would intentionally flood the market with oil surplus to lower the prices to just ridiculously low levels. Now, the problem was that smaller companies couldn't compete. It costs a lot of money in workers, in oil derricks, materials, everything like that. It costs a lot of money to produce a barrel of oil. And when you're a small oil man trying to get your business started, and you've taken out loans from the bank, maybe done a second mortgage on your house to get what you need to start your company, you can't afford for prices to go down, because pretty soon it's not worth it for you to stay in business. It might cost so much to create a barrel of oil if you're only going to sell it for pennies worth of profit, or in fact lose money. Then you got to get out of the business because you're dying. Financially you're desperate and you're done. Now, John D. Rockefeller had plenty of money, so whenever he would do this tactic, he could afford to take the hit, but the smaller companies could not. And when the smaller companies were struggling to make ends meet, Rockefeller would come along and buy them. He'd say, you know what, I'll take your company and I'll make you a partner in my company. It's a foolproof deal. Not only will you not go bankrupt, you'll be a part of my company, a shareholder, and you'll make millions. Now, the result was that when you use that tactic, when you buy up the smaller companies and make their owners part of your company, it's called a trust. And the Standard Oil Trust eventually got to a point where it controlled 95% of America's oil refineries by 1877, only 7 years after Standard Oil formed. Once he controlled all the market, he'd take some of the oil off the market to eliminate the surplus. He'd scale back on oil production, because then prices would stabilize. When there wasn't the surplus anymore, prices could go back up. And John D. Rockefeller would go back to making money, and often investing that money in buying railroads, getting involved in banks, getting involved in shipping, and things along those lines. It's kind of a long explanation, but when you think about it, it was pretty ingenious the way he went about it, even if small oil men and small businesses across America hated him for it. When it was all said and done, John D. Rockefeller had a net worth of $340 billion in today's dollars. I've seen lists where they have the richest men in the history of the world with their wealth adjusted for inflation and prices at the time and everything like that. And on most lists, John D. Rockefeller is considered the third wealthiest man in the history of the world. $340 billion in today's dollars would be way ahead of Steve Jobs, way ahead of the guys who run Microsoft and things like that are at around Bill Gates, guys like that are around $65 billion. John D. Rockefeller in today's money was worth $340 billion. If you think about that, that's absolutely crazy. But as Rockefeller was getting older, and he lived to be much older than Carnegie, Vanderbilt, any of those guys that were considered his peers at this time in history, as he got to be older, he began to get concerned about the legacy that he was leaving behind for his family and the image that he had created through his business practices. His primary concern was that people would always remember him not as a God-fearing man or a pious man, but as an evil man who crushed everybody in his path. So he decided to take some measures to try to remedy that image and that situation. He hired a photographer in his elderly years to try to follow him around and improve his public image. His most common thing was to give away nickels to little kids. Anytime he came across one, he'd give a nickel to a kid and make sure that photographer was there to photograph the event. It was really one of the first times in history that any major monopolist had attempted a public relations campaign, a campaign to basically improve his public image. But again, the idea was that he had made so much money, $340 billion, that, I don't know if he actually questioned his own practices and how he made that money, but he definitely wanted people to think better of him than they had when he was a younger man. Now, Rockefeller's contributions eventually expanded well beyond just giving nickels to kids. This is a picture of the GE building at Rockefeller Center in New York City. And this is Rockefeller Plaza. This is kind of a symbolic scene every Christmas time. It's kind of the central focus of New York City with its ice skating and Christmas tree and the GE building in the background. Basically, this becomes a national monument to feeling good and being thankful for what you have. That essentially is what John D. Rockefeller did near the tail end of his life and what he wanted to do with his legacy. To not be known as an evil businessman or to be admired as a captain of industry, but in the end, give away even more money than Andrew Carnegie had, who will become known as the main philanthropist of his time. Okay, that's it. Thanks for listening.